Good morning to everyone joining us today. We are just going to wait a couple more seconds to allow everyone the time to connect, and then we'll kick things off. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the official launch of GWEC's Global Wind Report 2021. This is GWEC's 16th edition of its flagship report. And this year, we've published an extra special edition in the run-up to COP, which looks at wind energy's role on the road to COP26. If you haven't downloaded the report already and read it, you can download it now by scanning that QR code on your screen. Today, we have a very exciting launch event and a jam-packed hour. So, we have people joining us from Beijing to DC in this truly global webinar. We'll first hear some opening remarks from GWEC's CEO, Ben Backwell, and then hand it over to Morten Durholm, who is GWEC's chair and also VP at Vestas. And then we will have the top 5 takeaways from the Global Wind Report presented by one of the report's lead authors, Joyce Lee. And then we're going to be doing a world tour of some of the most important wind energy markets around the world today. So stay tuned, and I won't waste. If you have any more questions, sorry, before we get started, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, all of the GWEC experts are online to answer them. So you can submit your questions in the Q&A panel on the Zoom toolbar, and our GWEC experts are online to answer your questions. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to GWEC CEO Ben Backwell for some opening remarks. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and good morning, everyone. And it's really great to be joined by so many colleagues and friends around the world. I just want to say a few things about this year's Global Wind Report, which is a little bit different from reports we've done in the past. 2021 is really a landmark year for us, and I think for people around the world. It's really the year where the world needs to take decisive action to head off potentially catastrophic climate change and come up with their commitments based on the Paris Agreement, which will really take us to where we need to go in terms of action on the ground. And wind energy, I think, is ready to play a very important and serious role within that, as really one of the best ways to replace carbon, the most efficient way per megawatt to replace carbon emissions in the power system and in the wider energy system. So it's a really important year. Last year in 2020 was the biggest year ever for the wind industry, with 93 gigawatts installed. So really an amazing year, I think, and a huge achievement by everyone in this industry, particularly because, as we know, we've been through this very strange and distressing time of the pandemic, with disruptions to the supply chain, and we've got through it with really with flying colors, with the biggest year ever, and with the industry really showing its resilience. Now, one thing that will be really clear from the findings of this report is, even though the wind industry had a record year in 2020, the growth was very much concentrated in 2 geographies, in particular China and the US, and we'll be hearing from our colleagues from both of those areas, both of those countries in this webinar. But really the rest of the world needs to really step up and increase its ambition and its level of installations. And there's many countries that have high ambitions and good government ambition for wind, but which are really lagging behind not because of their ambition, but because of kind of problems with execution on the ground. And this is my final takeaway. I mean, the problems we face as an industry now are basically to do with what I would call non-economic issues, right? So the LCOE, or levelized cost of energy, of wind energy is competitive around the world. And there's plenty of money wanting to go into wind energy. There's a huge appetite from investors. So it's not a question of money in most areas around the world. It is a question of having the right level of ambition, being able to work together to really radically speed up on things like permitting and licensing, where it's still everything takes basically forever to get anything done in many countries around the world. And I think one of the key takeaways from the report is that we need to work together and have a really kind of climate emergency approach between industry, governments, and communities to really get things where they need to be. We need to be on something like 180 gigawatts every year of installations. We did 93 last year. That's great. But we're ready to do a lot more as an industry, and we need to make sure we get everyone on side so that we can efficiently work together to get it done. So I'll hand it back to Elisa. And again, thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks so much, Ben. I will now hand it off to Morten Durholm, who is GWEC's Vice Chair and also the group's Senior Vice President of Vestas, who is the leading sponsor for this year's Global Wind Report. So I'll hand it off to you now, Morten.
Thank you, Elisa, and a big thank you to the whole GWEC team for producing this flagship report. It's been a pleasure for me to serve as the chairman of GWEC through a very challenging COVID year of 2020, but a year where we have, as an industry, again proven that we are going to be one of the dominant energy sources of the future, with a record year for installations. But as Ben was also saying, we need to radically increase the amount of installations going forward if we are to meet the Paris commitments. And I think for this release today should really be seen as a watershed moment where we kick off a call to action all the way up towards the COP meeting later this year. We need to ensure that policymakers and stakeholders all across the industry understands that we need to double the rate of installations, and we need to get going fast, because as Ben was also noting, the growth here was mainly coming from the US and China, and there's so much more to be done in all the rest of the world in order to speed up the growth of installations in the wind sector. With this growth, of course, also comes responsibility for us as a sector. We are no longer niche. We are going to be providing the electrons of the future. And that means we as an industry also need to look at our own decarbonisation targets with sustainability programs. But it also means, as the report notes, we have to increase the level of partnerships with other parts of the energy infrastructure. We can definitely learn from other parts of the energy sector. We have to partner with the solar sector, with storage. We have to look at PTX. We have to advise and guide the oil and gas sector who are now moving into the sector. And we need to have everyone on board for us to reach the Paris targets. So I hope really that everyone listening in today spread the word, spread the report. Let's use this moment as a call to action and ensure that everyone understands what needs to be done for us to hit the Paris Agreement targets. So big thank you from me to everyone on the call and to the GWEC team, and I'll hand it back to you, Elisa.
Thanks so much, Morten, for that. Indeed, a really exciting time for the global wind industry. So now I'm going to be handing it over to GWEC's Head of Policy and Projects, Joyce Lee, who is also one of the lead authors for the report, along with GWEC's Head of Market Intelligence and Strategy, Feng Zhao. And Joyce is going to be going through the top 5 takeaways of the Global Wind Report 2021. So over to you, Joyce.
Great. Thank you so much, Alyssa, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. It's a big pleasure to be joining you all today to introduce the top 5 takeaways of this year's Global Wind Report 2021. I'll be walking through the most significant findings and headlines from our report, and let's jump right in with the first top takeaway, which is that 2020 was a record year for wind energy. Wind had a banner year in 2020. We saw record installations of 93 gigawatts, and that's according to GWEC's market intelligence practice, which builds bottom-up, project-by-project calculations around the world. That 93 gigawatts represents a 53% increase from the previous year's installations, which is explosive growth, reflecting a strong bounce back of the wind sector from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas the first half of 2020, as Ben noted, did see several projects delayed, construction halted, manufacturing activity suspended. We did see a surge of activity in the second half of the year. And the recovery of growth as a result was split between 86.9 gigawatts of onshore wind installations, as well as 6.1 gigawatts of new offshore installations, making last year the best year for onshore wind growth in history and the second best year for offshore wind growth after 2019. Moving straight on to our second takeaway on onshore wind growth, which was led by a surge in China and the US. 3/4 of the wind energy installations last year were concentrated in these two markets, not only the world's largest economies, but also still the largest markets for onshore wind. More than half of the new onshore installations were based in China, driven by the expiration of the feed-in tariff for grid-connected onshore wind projects by the end of 2020. There was a similar story in the US, where a rush to market was led by the phase out of the production tax credit, or PTC, under the planned original deadline of 2020. Although the PTC has since been extended for projects beginning construction in 2016 or 2017, allowing them an extra year of construction due to COVID-related pressures on the supply chain, the US was still home to nearly 1/5 of new global onshore installations last year. Other top onshore markets behind China and the US include Brazil, Norway, and Germany. And while incentive and support mechanisms still play a large role in steering wind growth worldwide, especially in new and early stage markets, the trend towards competitive bidding schemes like reverse auctions and tenders organized by governments continues. So we saw 34 gigawatts of new onshore wind capacity awarded through auctions worldwide last year. But let's come back to that 34 gigawatt figure in just a second. For now, I will move straight on to our third takeaway, which is on offshore wind, where we saw robust growth, again led by China. For the third year in a row, China was the top country for offshore wind installations globally, with 3 gigawatts of new capacity. This was followed by steady growth in Europe, led by the Netherlands with nearly 1.5 gigawatts, and by Belgium with around 700 megawatts. Closing out our top 5 markets for offshore wind are the UK and Germany, although growth has slowed in both markets due to, in the UK, the gap between project execution in the contracts for difference, or CFD, rounds 1 and 2, and in Germany, a smaller near-term pipeline for offshore wind projects. Also worth noting in the offshore sector last year that Portugal commissioned 2 new floating wind turbines, totaling 17 megawatts. In terms of auctions, while only 1 gigawatt of offshore wind was awarded through auctions last year, there was more than 7 gigawatts of offshore wind tenders launched, including 5.5 gigawatts through the state solicitations in the US. The remainder came from Denmark as well as Japan, which launched fixed and floating offshore wind tenders last year, which complements its milestone offshore wind industry vision published in December. Overall, the UK remains the top market globally for offshore wind, followed by China and Germany, and the offshore wind market continues to grow from strength to strength, achieving 29% compound annual growth over the last 5 years. GWEC expects that growth to continue. The volume of new installations for offshore wind is going to quadruple by 2025. In that year, we're already forecasting 24 gigawatts of new offshore capacity, which by then will comprise 1/5 of the total new wind installations, which is a strong reflection of the expanding role of offshore wind in driving wind's global growth. And now I'd like to step back for our fourth takeaway, which is going to be about this decade. This is really the make or break decade to meet our Paris targets. So we're looking at 743 gigawatts of cumulative global wind capacity as of the end of 2020, which, by the way, translates to 1.1 billion tons of avoided carbon emissions each year, or the equivalent of the entire annual carbon emissions for South America. But as stated by Ben and by Morten and by us in this year's report, we simply aren't moving fast enough. While last year saw milestone commitments to carbon neutrality from the EU, China, Japan, South Korea, Canada, South Africa, and others, we now need to translate the sense of optimism into practical actions. Otherwise, even in the most optimistic scenarios, we're still going to fall several degrees north of that 2-degree global warming benchmark. To meet our Paris targets to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, we're going to need to dramatically ramp up wind growth from current levels of around 90 gigawatts per year to around 180 gigawatts per year, represented here in the yellow line on the graph. This is going to be the level of deployment required to get us to that interim 2030 target set by IRENA in its Paris-compliant transforming energy scenario. And as shown in the graph, where you can see GWEC's 5-year outlook out to 2025, represented in the navy columns, wind growth under current policies is hovering at around half of that volume. And for every year we fall short of reaching the level of deployment needed, we're going to need to compensate dramatically in the latter half of the decade with a rise, really a spike in installations up to as high as 280 gigawatts by the end of this decade. So I'd like to return to that figure of 34 gigawatts of onshore wind awarded through government-run auctions in 2020. Of course, this figure is lower than in 2019 due to pandemic-related delays, as well as decreases in energy demand during COVID. But looking ahead, we're going to need to see those markets which are ready for renewable energy tenders scale up their ambition to foster the required installations in this decade. And how do we create the right conditions to reset the pace of growth? In our report, we go over different kind of policy measures that are needed under a climate emergency approach to wind energy, from more ambitious capacity targets to more streamlined and simplified permitting schemes, to granting priority status to wind projects, to effective policy frameworks for corporate procurement and repowering of older wind projects, and much more. Concurrent to that, we're going to need to see a massive increase in investments in grid, transmission, ports, and other infrastructure to enable larger shares of renewables integration. This brings me to my final takeaway for this report, which is that wind energy can't do it alone. It's not wind alone that will get us to net zero. We'll need to collaborate and innovate with other sectors and other actors to deliver system-wide decarbonization. A net zero target by 2050 is increasingly the focal point of international climate conversations and is indeed this year's theme for the 2021 Global Wind Report. In the report, we look at the central logic of the road to net zero, which will be to electrify everything possible in line with a cost-optimal transition. And that means leveraging existing, mature, and cost-competitive technologies like wind energy to dispatch green power to homes, to buildings, to the infrastructure of our cities, to certain industries, and to short distance transport. It's also worth noting that offshore wind, as well as hybrid projects that combine wind with technologies like solar, offer more stable generation profiles, which can complement the continuous power demands of sectors like buildings and industry. And then there are the so-called hard to abate sectors like heavy industry, chemicals, aviation, and other forms of long-haul transport, where there are higher barriers to electrification. For these, we're going to need to see breakthrough scalable solutions and energy carrier technologies like green hydrogen for storage and power-to-X applications of hydrogen as fuel or feedstock. We're also going to need to see more flexible and modern grids to enable higher rates of renewables penetration, as well as greater responsiveness to power supply and demand. So in this year's report, we examined the actions behind different long-term energy scenarios, which can get us to 1.5 degrees or to net zero. And there's wide consensus about large-scale renewables deployment, wide-scale electrification, and some of these enabling technologies. And these scenarios also call for energy efficiency measures, as well as a degree of behavioral change on our part. All of these things are going to require the wind industry to work together with policymakers as well as with other energy and technology sectors. A key constituent for us is going to be the oil and gas sector, which is in an irreversible one-way street to clean energy. the wind industry has received more investment from the oil and gas sector than any other low carbon technology in the last 5 years. And we need to continue collaborating to ensure that there's transfer of knowledge and experience from this sector to those like offshore wind, and leverage opportunities to bring that large-scale financing, innovation, and operational capacity in that sector of oil and gas to help us fast-track our road to net zero. And that brings me to the end of our top 5 takeaways. Of course, I encourage everyone to download the report from the GWEC website. There's many more insights in there, from deep dives in emerging markets to circular economy in the wind industry. I'll be sticking around along with my colleagues to answer any questions from the audience in the chat, but we'll hand it now back to Alyssa for the next segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for those top 5 takeaways. And as Joyce mentioned, please download the report to find out more about all of those findings we have in the Global Wind Report. So now we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so doing a world tour of some key wind power markets across the world. Although most of us can't travel because of COVID restrictions, we're taking the time today to really to take you on a tour with us across the world and visit some key places from China to South Africa to the US. So buckle up, and I'm going to hand it off to Stuart Mullen, GWEC COO now, who is our global correspondent today, and will take you through our world tour. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and welcome everybody. Thank you for the fantastic flyby, I guess, from Joyce and Morten and Ben to start off. And as people say, it's been a fascinating year. And let's now jump in the GWEC jet and take some, I guess, green mileage to around the world. And our first stop is going to be China. And here I am again from sunny Denmark to China. And so here I am joined by Feng Zhao, GWEC's own Feng Zhao, one of the key authors of the report, and also Mr. Qin from the Chinese Wind Energy Association. So Feng, I'll start with you. What factors drove China's record growth in 2020 despite COVID?
Thank you for the question, Stuart. I think it's a fantastic year in terms of installation in China. That's my home country. It's no doubt about an explosive growth within more than 50 gigawatts installed in a single year. But anyway, even though the number is a surprise, but that's within our expectation. The key factors for such a growth in a single year under the challenge of COVID-19, I think it's simple, mainly driven by the policy change. If we're looking at what has been going on over the past 2 years, I think the wind industry has been well informed, prepared for this growth. Back in 2019, in May, the National Energy Authority, NEA or NDRC, they have made it clear, they provide the clear roadmap for both onshore and offshore. For onshore, by the end of 2020, they got to get project fully grid connected in order to qualify the feed-in tariff. That's driven, huge growth for onshore wind. On top of that, we also have fantastic year for offshore. This is mainly due to the same regulation. For offshore, they give like a 1 year extra for offshore wind to qualify the feed-in tariff. For both offshore and intertidal, they have different feed-in tariff scheme. For those projects have to be built by the end of this year, 2021, in order to qualify the feed-in tariff. Normally offshore wind we have relatively longer lead time, so industry have to move even, prepare earlier, move faster. So that's why we also have a fantastic year for offshore in China. Last year, grid connected with 3,060 megawatts. That's a world record, and make China replace Germany as the second largest market in terms of total offshore wind installation. And there are many other factors, but all in all, I think policy driven, that's absolutely the key factors. Now I'm going to pass it to Qin. He knows more than I do as the Secretary General at the Chinese Wind Association.
Yeah, Mr. Qin. Mr. Qin.
Yeah. Hey, how are you? It's my pleasure to participate in the announcement. It's an important report. As just Mr. Zhao Feng have mentioned, because the policy change, we will the intensive policy will be phased out the end of last year. So everyone should run fast before the door closed. This is the main reason why we can install the more than 52 gigawatt during last year. But another important thing, I think, because at first the pandemic impacted China's wind industry during the first quarter of last year. Everyone think it's a big problem for last year. But because the Chinese government's extremely effective measure of controlling the epidemic, and the second is we have a very strong supply chain with resilience. It was a surprise test for industry capacity and capability, because as you know, the President Xi Jinping announced the ambition target. We in China will achieve carbon neutrality for 26. So it needs more wind, and we think we should install 50 gigawatt at least every year from next year. So this year it's a demonstration. We can meet the requirement. We have capability. We have capacity to achieve the target. Anyway, we should admit it is still influenced by the global supply. And we know better than ever before that international cooperation is necessary. Okay.
Thank you very much. And so after the feed-in tariff expires, what will really drive the growth forward? What's the motivation there in the market? Is it the carbon neutrality?
You mean last year or from this year?
Yeah, once the feed-in tariff expires.
Feed-in tariff for onshore will phase out the end of last year. And if you cannot install before the end of last year, you cannot get a feed-in tariff. And the tariff should be equal to coal power plant price. And but for offshore this year, if you installed before the end of this year, you can get a feed-in tariff also.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to leave it there for China now, and so now we will jump in the GWEC jet and head to Vietnam. Thank you very much. And here in Vietnam, I'm joined with GWEC's own Li Ming. How are you doing on this beautiful sunny day, Li Ming?
Good, good, good. Thank you, Stuart.
So again, if we start with Vietnam, Vietnam's a market with huge onshore and offshore potential. But what needs to happen at the policy level to scale up and realize Vietnam's potential?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really, really good question, because now as we speak, we actually see the PDP, the Power Development Plan 8 is being finalized by the government, where we've seen a very much like ramp up of the government ambitions on wind, where we actually see by 2030, they're talking about 18 gigawatt of wind installed, which is a massive, massive kind of like scale up from their previous PDP. And for this to happen, really, I mean, there are lots of things that we can point out, but the first thing that I really want to highlight is the grid. I think Vietnam really reached to that moment where the penetration of wind reached a certain percentage, and also other renewables, especially last year, we've seen like 13 gigawatts of solar came onto the grid. So I think the challenge is really how do we expand the transmission line, and how does the grid take all these variable renewables and provide the right flexibility to accommodate that. On top of that is also like the offshore wind, whether the government is really ready to develop the offshore wind where they have really good resources, but they need the right policy to kick it off. And apart from that, I think the other one I would really say is the finance, that we need that for onshore. And we were having problem with the project finance with the PPA. But I think onshore, there are ways that you can go around, but for offshore, that is really like, you have to fix it to allow that scale of finance to really flow in. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liming. So Vietnam is still very dependent on coal and LNG imports to fuel the country's growing energy demand. What are the benefits of accelerating the energy transition in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and what role will wind play in that transition?
I think that's a really good remark, and also to bring actually the LNG into the picture, because we do see that LNG is very much also heavily like featured in the PDP and also seen as a major transitional kind of like technology. But I actually want to highlight that in this transition, that wind, especially offshore wind, has a lot of things to offer. And especially if the government is looking at LNG as the transitional kind of like technology, then they should actually look at is the offshore wind, which offers all the things that LNG offers, like the higher capacity, the management, the stability, the size, the scale, all of that. But on the other hand, offshore wind actually offers more, which I just want to highlight a few. Improvement of the balance of trade, where if you work on the LNG after the product is done, then 95% of the future cost is on fuel, which goes to other countries basically. But if you invest into like an offshore wind project, once the project is done, then all the future, like O&M or any other cost that will happen in the future, are mainly generated like in the local market. And the second is about the cost. I mean, this goes back to the whole fuel discussion, that if you just let your energy system to be dependent on the global fuel market, then you never can predict how the cost will be. So if like LNG is really like the future choice, then we clearly are going to see like a more fluctuated like energy price, and also highly likely to be a future LCOE on rise, where if you invested into the offshore wind, then you're clearly going to see a downward like LCOE kind of trajectory. And the other one is the timeline. I mean, offshore wind actually have lots of things to offer for this like energy hungry, electricity hungry Vietnam. I mean, comparing with LNG or other technology, we actually are quite competitive if you look at the construction and development timeline.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Liming. I think we could spend quite some time, particularly now, discussing Vietnam. So maybe that's the subject for another webinar in the near future. Now I would like us to head to India, where we'll be joined with our newest member of the GWIC team. And here I am joined with Martin from GWIC. So welcome, Martin, and thank you very much for joining us here today. So jumping straight into the question, lost my video. Jumping straight into the question, India was named 9th in terms of new power installations in 2020, but the country only installed half of what was installed in the previous year. What were the many factors contributing to the slowdown? Oh, you're on mute, Martin.
Stuart, we are all aware that wind has been the dominant energy source in terms of grid interactive renewable energy system that we have in India, almost 38 to 39 gigawatt out of the 92 gigawatt installed capacity. But we have seen some deacceleration in the growth of wind power in the country since 2018. And the decline in growth of wind power is not just cannot just be attributed to the global pandemic and to the lockdown. So like I said, it has been happening since 2018, and most likely it is because of policy and regulatory issues that are in place. And beyond this, we are also facing infrastructure issues in India, for example, transmission capacity and those land acquisition related issues. So if these issues are amicably addressed with partnership between the private communities and the government, perhaps wind is going to contribute immensely to India's future growth strategy and also to net zero strategies whenever India comes up with one. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And there's been a bit of chatter recently about India setting some net zero targets by 2050. If these targets are to be set, what role will wind play in achieving these targets?
Stuart, I think that is a very pertinent question, given the fact that there is a huge momentum building. Locally, there are institutions and both government institutions and private institutions that are adopting net zero targets for themselves. So you're right that there is discussion about India's net zero targets. At GWEC India, we believe that wind is going to be going to play a profound role in India's net zero targets. Whether one sees India wind power without solar and independent of solar, wind is certainly going to make a big contribution. India has already set a target of 140 gigawatt by 2030, which is a big target. But in order to achieve net zero targets, India will have to go beyond its current NDC. So which means that India will have to increase its targets for wind power, and certainly it will have to go beyond what has already been planned. And like I said, solar also and wind have a great complementary role, and that's why the government of late has started promoting hybrid projects. And we see and we have a firm belief that wind market is again going to make a great comeback in India. And I will re-emphasize and reiterate that wind is going to play a profound and prominent role in India's net zero future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. It sounds like a familiar theme that India's doing a lot, but it could be doing more. So it's fantastic. So thank you very much for that. Now we'll head to South Africa, where we'll be joined from the South African Wind Association. Natumbi, thank you very much for joining us from the South Africa Wind Energy Association. So it was a pretty good year for South Africa last year, and South Africa continued to lead wind power growth in Africa in 2020. What has contributed to the success of the South African wind market, and can other countries in the region learn from what South Africa is doing?
Thanks, Stuart. It's quite an exciting period for the wind sector in South Africa. We're seeing the projects under construction being finalized and new projects being announced this year. And I would say the contributing factor is the fact that we have an aging power station fleet, which is mostly carbon intensive, coal-fired power stations. And as a result, we are in a power crisis where we experience energy demand exceeding available supply. So, and to close that capacity gap that we have, government has taken a decision to transition from coal to renewables, and a big part of the renewables capacity is allocated to wind power, which is great for the sector. And the reason for that is because the power mix that we're looking at in future, it needs to be affordable, it needs to be clean, it needs to be quick to build, because we are currently in a power crisis. So our industry is very much policy driven, and I think it's the same for all the other countries. And so for other countries, I think to learn is a strong and visionary leadership from government is quite important for the growth of the sector. Of course, it's not easy for government because they have to get to a point where they have to manage a complex stakeholder engagement process to get to a point where we agree about the power mix that is suitable to power the country. And then soon after that, then move to policy approvals and followed by a clear action plan of what is going to be procured by when. And this is where we are currently, and it's quite an exciting period.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's a really interesting answer. Then I'm glad you mentioned the policy. I mean, we've had, with 14 gigawatts of new capacity earmarked over the next decade, will this growth be sufficient to help South Africa meet its net zero targets? And what needs to happen to further scale up the growth?
Of course, it won't be sufficient to meet the net zero target, but I think it's a good start. Because by end of 2030, so we've got an IRP that maps out the power mix for the next 10 years. So by end of 2030, the wind will contribute 22.5% to full installed capacity. And total renewables will be 33%, which includes now solar PV of the total installed capacity. So obviously, with 33%, the balance is then a mix of carbon intensive technologies. But the good news is during these 10 years, we are decommissioning 11 gigawatts of coal power stations. From 2030 to 2050, plan to decommission a further 24 gigawatts of coal power stations. So there's gonna be an even bigger demand for wind power and solar PV to actually close the gap created by decommissioning coal. So short answer to your question is yes, we will. I think we will contribute a lot to reaching the net zero target by 2050.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Just one thing before I let you go. What about offshore wind in South Africa?
Offshore wind in South Africa, we have a couple of developers now who are looking at the options. We have academic institutions who are doing feasibility studies, quite exciting. There is a huge potential. The only reason I think it hasn't taken off is because of the way our shores are so deep. It's very difficult. But I think with floating foundation technologies, it's going to make it possible for South Africa, and we're looking forward to the development.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's fascinating. So now we'll head to Brazil. We'll be joined from Ibiolica. Thank you very much, Selma, for joining us here, which is a very early start for the morning for you. But Brazil was ranked 3rd in terms of new wind capacity in 2020 and now ranks 7th in the world for total onshore wind capacity. What key factors have contributed to Brazil's leadership in wind power?
Thank you, Stuart. Well, I would start mentioning that historically, the exceptional quality of the Brazilian wind, that's the first explanations that we must give. And this exceptional quality made this form of energy very competitive here in Brazil. Then in second, a very efficient supply chain that was built really quick in the first years of the wind power industry. And also very important, the financial options, mainly the options from BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, that played very important, a crucial role in developing this sector in Brazil. But that is speaking historically. If we're going to focus on the last few years, we need to highlight the role of the free market, which has been growing a lot in Brazil. 2018 was the first year that we closed more contracts in the free market than in the auctions in the regulated market. And that situation repeated itself in 2019. And then last year, with the huge drop in demand caused by the pandemic, we saw that the free market being really, vital to the sector, since we had no auctions last year in Brazil. But we kept contracting. Even in the difficult year of 2020, we kept contracting with the free market, and we estimate that the industry has closed around 3 gigawatts of new energy contracts in the free market last year. So I think it's important to highlight that. And also to highlight that the free market has been responsible for a lot of innovations in the form of contracts here in Brazil. So it's not growing only in numbers, but also in terms of quality, because we are seeing that the companies now are not selling just the energy itself, but they are being really creative with different ways of contracts. And for instance, like making the buyer the partner of the wind farm itself, with very personalized contracts to build a farm from scratch from a specific buyer. So it depends on the customer needs. So all these innovations, together with the mature industry that we now have, we think that this scenario not only made the wind energy the second energy source in Brazil right now, but they also put the wind industry as a major actor for the future here.
Thank you very much. Brazil set an indicative goal of being carbon neutral by 2060. What role will wind power need to play in achieving that? And in particular, we're going to see the emergence of an offshore wind sector and power to X or green hydrogen in this transition.
Yes, well, we are very happy. We are very happy here discussing offshore and green energy. It's an exciting moment for us. I should mention that the National Energy Plan for 2050 indicates that the expansion of the Brazilian electric sector in Brazil will be through renewable sources. So there is no doubt of that, mainly wind and solar for the next 30 years. It's important to note that here in Brazil, the electric matrix is already pretty renewable, mainly because of hydroelectric plants. But the thing is that we are done exploring this source here in Brazil, especially because of the environmental impact. So the expansion will certainly be mainly through wind and solar. So there's no question in that. And of course, wind will help achieving this goal that you mentioned. And we are very optimistic because we are seeing new ways for the wind to grow in Brazil, besides the huge potential that we have for offshore. Because here in Brazil, we have a potential that is 3 times more than all our matrix, only for onshore wind. And now we are seeing that this path is even bigger because of offshore wind. EPE, which is the energy research company, it's a government company here in Brazil, has issued an offshore roadmap. We are following the discussions about the regulations for this new market in the Brazilian Senate as well. And we see that all the major players, the big industries, are already participating in the discussion. They are reaching us here at Abeolica. Together with GWEC, we have been able to have all these discussions. So we believe we may see our first offshore wind farms here in Brazil before 2030. So, and we are also following and taking part in the important discussions about green hydrogen. Considering that Brazil, I think we must consider that we have such a good offer of renewable sources that it seems natural for us to have all this potential to play an important role in the green hydrogen business. I mean, it's like the perfect marriage with such good wind that we have at our disposal. And we are already seeing international companies reaching the government, mainly the government from the Northeast states, where we have the most, the greatest capacity in wind, to discuss implementing new green hydrogen business in Brazil to add to some Brazilian companies that are also already working its ways into this business. So, and recently EPE also released a technical note, a report showing that the importance for Brazil to develop a national hydrogen plan. And in this document, they clearly state that offshore wind has a fundamental role in reducing costs for hydrogen production in Brazil. And they also mentioned that this green hydrogen can collaborate with the decarbonization of other sectors, of parallel sectors, such as the transport one. And in Brazil, this is a big issue, because more than 70% of our products here in Brazil circulated and are transported inside the country by roads. So decarbonizing the transport is really a big deal here for Brazil. So, well, that's it. It's a message of optimism.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's interesting, I guess Joyce's fifth takeaway relates to that point quite well. Just before we leave you, I'd like to pass on our condolences to you and your colleagues on the tragic passing of Camila Rodriguez with the COVID, with complications due to COVID. It's a shame to lose such a lovely young woman under those circumstances. So our deepest sympathies go out to you and your colleagues for that loss.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. It's a tough time here for us, and we appreciate the message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll head north to Mexico. And here I'm joined by Ramon Fiestas from GWEC. Ramon, I guess it's fair to say that it's been an interesting couple of months for Mexico, but Mexico's wind power growth has slowed down significantly in recent years. What are the main factors contributing to this slowdown?
Thanks, Stuart. Well, I'm afraid the picture of Mexico this year is not as bright as it is in other markets in the region, yes. Despite the excellent conditions for wind energy development in Mexico, everybody knows, in 2020, the country dropped from the second largest position in the region of annual installed capacity in wind power to the fourth. And this slowdown was a counterflow to the path of growth shown by the major markets in the region, which achieved its annual record with near to 4.7 additional gigawatts. The decrease in Mexico is directly linked to the enforcement of a political energy agenda that started in 2018 and is challenging investments in renewable energy with a number of regulatory decisions aiming to strengthen the dominant position of the state-owned utility, as well in the electricity generation market. So the implementation of the measures in support of this new political will has strongly undermined the regulatory framework for existing renewable investment and has eroded the normal chronology for the development of the projects, as well as the flows to fuel the pipeline of projects to ensure the path to meet the country's renewable energy targets. So I think the legal uncertainty is undermining severely the climate for private investments in the energy sector in Mexico. As the drivers of this new energy agenda are currently in absolute contradiction with the principles for the governance of the country energy resources that created the framework for these investments. So I mean free investments in generation assets and competition in the electricity market. These two pillars are destroyed by current policies, and these new policies are aiming to avoid private investments in the electricity generation assets in the electricity sector. And on the other hand, the lack of public calls for renewable energy long-term PPA tenders is trying the pipeline of existing projects that are already under construction and are putting at risk the path of the renewable energy targets for the country. This is the situation there.
Yeah, it seems like it's a fairly tricky situation to navigate. What does the bill mean for the sector in general and Mexico's energy transition, the electricity bill reform?
Yeah, Stuart, the latest, let's say the latest piece of the policy enacted in Mexico was a bill that is revising the principles of the bill enacted after the constitutional reform that has been constructing the framework for the private investments and the electricity market functioning under competition scheme. So this new bill, fortunately, has been rejected by the court at the first instance in this moment. And this means that the application of the bill is suspended while the trial is coming into the High Court. So this means that currently what is under let's say legal enforcement is the ancient regime, and the current state of the trials, despite they are impeding further secondary regulation based on this bill that, as I told you, is still rejected. If the attitude of the current administration persists and does not follow the roadmap to ensure renewable energy investments through the call for new tenders and opening the market for new private power purchase agreements, it is clearly or crystal clear that the market in Mexico is decoupling with the country roadmap to ensure decarbonization targets. So the country is going to lose the path of the energy transition, which you know perfectly means putting at risk the competitiveness of the economy in Mexico and its own environmental sustainability, and of course public health, that, as is in the case in Brazil, is stressing strongly the sanitary system in the country. So we think that this is probably the worst picture that we can show.
Yeah, thanks, Ramon. It doesn't sound like a very pleasant picture, and I hope that we can straighten the Mexican market up in the coming over the coming period. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Again, Mexico is one of those areas where we could probably have another webinar in itself just about what's happening in Mexico, but we'll leave you there. Thank you very much. And now we'll head to your neighbor in the USA, and we'll be joined by John Hensley from American Clean Power. John, welcome. Good morning to you. America loves becoming second in things. So this year you're number 2 after a record year for the States, but you're still number 2 in the world. So as the USA had a record year and the country continues to be the second largest onshore wind market globally after China, how did the US achieve this record growth despite the COVID challenges?
Hey, good morning, Stuart. Great to be on, and hats off to the GWEC team for putting together this global wind report. It's such a critical resource, and great to see it all come together here. You know, look, 2020 was really a tremendous year for the U.S. wind industry. Yet second place, but we'll take it. I think despite all the challenges that COVID placed on our businesses, we still shattered essentially every record for both growth of capacity and electricity penetration in the market. The fourth quarter itself was not only the strongest year on record, but it also saw more wind installed in just those last 3 months of the year than any full year in the modern U.S. wind industry's history, except for 2012. So, you know, just knocking out records left and right in 2020. Now, as you think about the factors, you know, we can boil it down to a number of different things. I think continued strong demand from American consumers has been driving a lot of the growth, not only in wind, but also in other clean energy technologies. The technological improvements, of course, have helped to bring down the costs, making renewable energy prices very competitive in the marketplace. And that's driving not only utilities to look to add this to their mix, but also really pushing the corporate demand side of the equation and seeing a lot more of these, you know, Fortune 500 companies that are turning to renewable energy and wind to power their businesses and achieve their sustainability goals. And then, of course, there's the regulatory and federal financial landscape as well to consider We had the last year of the 100% production tax credit available in 2020, which certainly spurred a lot of developers to action and resulted in a very strong year in 2020. But as we look forward, I think growth is set to continue. Got over 34 gigawatts of additional wind projects under construction or advanced development in the country. And 2021 is actually shaping up to rival 2020 in terms of new additions. So, you combine that with all the conversations going on the Hill and with the White House on how we can accelerate this clean energy transition. I think there's good news in 2020, but a lot more good news to come in 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into my next question. And yeah, congratulations on rejoining the Paris Agreement. I guess we've heard that America is expected to set a net zero target at their climate summit in April. What role do you think that wind power will have in achieving this? And in particular, the role of offshore wind and renewable hydrogen or power to X, what role will that play?
Yeah, so, obviously we applaud the Biden and Harris administration for reasserting our place in the Paris Agreement. And, we're looking forward to hitting the ground running to make up for lost time. I think wind and really the entire clean energy portfolio is going to play a major role in helping not only meet the Paris Agreement, but also as we think about some of these ambitious net zero emissions target by 2035 or whatever the case may end up being. It's going to be critical to deploy these technologies on scales that are 2 or 3 or even 4 times what we've done in recent history. So the ramping up of these industries is going to be critical. Of course, the generation technologies are not only important, but the supporting kind of energy storage technologies are as well. So things like batteries, the role of green hydrogen in the space is going to be important. And we're looking at different ways that we can help to incentivize those and accelerate the adoption of those technologies. But one of the things that we really like to keep in mind, especially as we think about the recovery from COVID, is that this reaching for these agreements and targets these targets under Paris Agreement doesn't have to come at an economic cost. In fact, it can be part of the economic recovery and economic growth that we're all looking for at this point in time. We've done some work that shows that by reaching a majority renewables grid by 2030 can actually have a hugely positive impact on the economy, not only in terms of reaching dramatic emissions reductions in the sector, but also in terms of deploying capital. We're going to see over $1 trillion of new capital deployed in these clean energy technologies over the next 10 years, but also in the job creation front. We're looking at potentially another 1 million jobs created in wind, solar, energy storage, and transmission over the next decade. And so, the green economy is a real thing, and it can certainly be a big part of the economic recovery going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's really exciting times, and we look forward to seeing what comes of it. And thank you very much for your getting up early this morning to join us for this GWEC seminar. And so now we head to the omnipresent global offshore market update with Alistair Dutton. So we'll fly to offshore. Good morning, Alistair, and thank you for joining me. As someone that has spent the last 7 years working in offshore, this is an area very close to my heart. The offshore wind market has grown over 106% over the last 5 years. How's the sector been able to scale up so rapidly across the world? And could the same principles be applied to scale up floating offshore wind when we get to there?
Thank you, Stuart, and hello, everyone. To answer your questions, so if we start with the sort of home of offshore wind in Europe, we've got a whole load of projects that have been in development, which provides a strong momentum to the market. Then we're using ever larger turbines. Latest numbers are sort of 15 megawatts, and we're deploying them in ever larger projects. So it's quite common now for a project to be at gigawatt scale. And then as the price of levelized cost of energy has come down to grid parity, all of a sudden governments can fund and support these projects way more than they ever have. So that gives the sort of multiple acceleration in the market. And then, as we saw from Joyce's presentation, China has really got offshore wind. In the last few years, it's been the dominant part of the market. And in this year, we expect China to become the largest in terms of total installed capacity. And then the rest of Asia comes alive as well. And then to your floating question, once floating gets to commercial scale, then we'll see the same impact as costs will continue to come down, projects will get bigger, but it's a tall ask at the moment, but there are some very capable people working on it at the moment. And with floating wind, I'll just say we treble the scale of the offshore opportunity worldwide. So it's a really exciting technology.
Yeah, I guess we're just looking for some scale projects in the floating wind space. But I guess we also need to look at renewable hydrogen and Power-to-X, and what opportunities do they have to accelerate growth of the industry? And can they help oil and gas companies achieve their net zero goals and also provide space for what we call this just transition?
Yeah, so offshore wind and hydrogen go together extremely well, particularly because of the sheer scale of the projects that will be involved and therefore the economies that come with it. And the wider topic of Power-to-X makes even larger opportunities, and particularly that you'd be able to site projects away from grid and demand centers for electricity in some of the very best wind in the world. And then oil and gas majors are transitioning into offshore wind. They bring with them a wonderful skill set and also some very large balance sheets. And so they're showing a strong desire for offshore wind with or without hydrogen. And so I expect this dynamic to continue for years to come.
Thank you very much. And we have gone a little bit over time now, but I hope you've enjoyed the trip. That brings us to the conclusion of our world tour in the GWEC jet. If you want to cash in some of those GWEC frequent flyer miles, be sure to reach out to me and we can hook you up with some market intel and other GWEC products like memberships if you're not already members. So Alyssa, I hand back to you now. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stuart, for taking us on that whirlwind tour of the wind markets. No pun intended there. It was, you know, a carbon neutral trip around the world, so very much in theme with our global wind report and achieving net zero. So thank you very much for that. Now, just to give final last words and to summarize what all this information means that we've been talking about over the past hour or so for the global wind industry moving forward. And in the lead up to COP26, I'm going to hand it off to GWEC CEO Ben Backwell now. Ben, over to you for some last words.
Thanks very much, Elisa. And it's been really enjoyable traveling around the world from my desk here in the UK and seeing everyone. It's really, it's great to see the energy and the kind of continued sort of positivity in the industry. And I think we can all rightly be very proud of what we've achieved over the last couple of years. And now we need to work together to take things to the next level and to keep rolling out this great resource and technology that we have. So this is a crucial year. I'd really appeal to everyone to work with GWEC and get involved in the different initiatives around COP26. It's a really great opportunity this year for us to be kind of raising our flag and showing what we can do on the road ahead to net zero. With governments and communities and creating all these great jobs and economic benefits. So, we've got, a whole world to win here, and let's work together to make it happen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Ben. And I would like to say huge thank you to all of our speakers who joined us here today from across the world, from every continent, and for sharing their insights with us. If you haven't already, please head to the Global GWEC website where you can download the Global Wind Report 2021 for further insights and information on all the markets we discussed here today and more on wind power's role on the road to net zero. Thanks everyone for joining us and have a good rest of your day. Cheers.